Because the voices of the people are essential to legitimate democratic government, I affirm, resolved in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. First, definitions. The definition of ought from the freedictionary.com is used to indicate obligation or duty. In context, this means governments have an obligation to make their elections compulsory. All other definitions will be defined in the context of this debate round. Values. My value is democracy. I value democracy because the fundamental focus of voting is to democratically elect leaders. The resolution also limits itself to democracies, so it is justified for us to limit the debate to democracy as well. My value criterion, the way in which I measure the value of democracy, is through popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the basic principle that democratic government's authority comes directly from its people. This is the best way to measure democracy because a government without proper authority is not possible. Contention 1. Functional democracy requires high levels of political participation. The continuous low rates of people who vote can defeat the purpose of democracy. By definition, democracy means government by the people. But if only a small fraction of the people vote, this system is not of benefit. In fact, when only a select people vote, the impacts can be disastrous. A study done in the ACTA Political Law Journal argues, quote, when casting their votes, people express their opinions and preferences of the politicians, policies, and politics of their country, region, and town. All citizens must have equal and effective opportunities for making their views known as to who should govern the country. In fact, this is why every defender of democracy knows universal suffrage to be a necessary requirement for any democratic regime, end quote. But, moreover, according to Jason Marisam, a postgraduate research fellow at Harvard Law School in 2009, the essence of the argument for why high voter turnout matters starts with the premise that democracy depends on some level of self-determination and governmental legitimacy. High turnout is one legitimating factor. Legitimacy is threatened when the state unduly restricts access to voting booths, even if the political system would remain reasonably effective and stable. Contention 2. Compulsory voting increases civic engagement. If voting were to be compulsory in a democracy, the idea of power to the people would be better utilized in terms of government decisions. This right is taken for granted by a considerable amount of the American populace. According to the 2012 U.S. Census, more than 200 million people were eligible to vote, about 150 million actually registered to vote, and in the 2008 presidential election, only 130 million people actually voted. That is significantly less than the number of people eligible to vote by about 70 million. Peter Orszag, the vice chairman of global banking at Citigroup Incorporated and a former director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Obama administration, states that, quote, voter participation rates are running below 60%, end quote. This means that only about half of the country is voting. This is detrimental to democracy in the sense that the outcome is pertaining to all, if not a wider range, of the country. By making voting compulsory, the burden of low participation rates is eliminated, and the system of democracy is overall more functional and wide-ranging. Certain civic duties, such as jury duty and paying taxes, are mandatory already, so there is no reason why participation in government elections should not be as well. The argument that compulsory voting violates one's autonomy is therefore invalid due to the fact that mandatory duties already exist in society. Moreover, this already happens in certain countries, so implementation is not an issue. An example where compulsory voting is effective would be in Australia, where those who don't vote get fined. The more times one chooses not to vote, the larger the fine becomes. Contention 3. Compulsory voting removes systematic barriers to political participation that many groups face. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, quote, minority voters still face significant obstacles in registering to vote and casting ballots. Additionally, people living in poverty and without higher education have historically lower voting rates than affluent, educated groups. Furthermore, according to nonprofitvote.org, specialized civic and voter education programs tend to increase voter turnout as well. However, in areas that lack these programs, specifically amongst poorer, less educated groups, voter turnout is lower. This means that certain people are less likely to be able to vote simply given the conditions that they were born into. Recently, This effect has been exacerbated by voter ID laws and registration restrictions that make voting more difficult and target minority communities, according to the ACLU. This is undeniable that these factors cause certain groups a disproportionate amount of difficulty when voting, which reduces turnout rates. This undermines democracy because not all the voices of the electorate are heard equally. The Supreme Court of the United States has previously ruled that the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution applies in cases like these where certain groups' votes have been systematically weakened. Thus, government is not only justified but obligated to ensure that all of its citizens have equal access to voting by making voting compulsory. For all of these reasons, I respectfully ask for an affirmative ballot and stand open for cross-examination.